I want to continue with the study of biblical theology where we were, the omnipresence of God. I believe we had more or less introduced the subject. Remember that we're dealing with God's attributes, and His attributes are not something that He has. They're simply perfections of God that explain His nature. God doesn't have holiness. He is holy. He doesn't have omniscience, wisdom. He is omniscient. So don't think of these things as things we just tack on God, but they are biblical descriptions of His infinite being. And I believe we said a little bit about omnipresence, which omni means all, and present means God is everywhere present. And we gave you several scriptures to show that. Psalm 139 especially shows that wherever a person goes, God is there. And omnipresence, we said, is that perfection of God whereby He is personally present everywhere in heaven and earth at one and the same time. How can God be omnipresent, we asked? It's because He is Spirit. And Spirit is not limited to space or time. Space, we said, is created by God to contain His creation. How that you could have space without an object in it, but you could not have object without space to put it in. And if this is all the space that God made, we'll say, let's say all He created was 10 by 5 feet. We put 2 by 4s between them. Then that's all the space there is. You couldn't get them any longer or wider. And if He'd have created just that much space, then you'd have to make your 2 by 4s that were created to put in there smaller. That much space, that's all you could get in it. We just keep going down till you get to nothing, then you couldn't put anything in it. So space is necessary. Since we are creatures that occupy space, we have a measure of spread, then we have to have something to spread out in. Even the most microscopic speck, and that isn't a microscopic speck, but even the most microscopic speck. Well, let's take an atom, trillions of atoms on the point of a pen. And yet every one of them has to have so much space to occupy, or it couldn't be there. We compared God being everywhere because He's Spirit being everywhere at once. We compared that to our soul, which is everywhere in our body. It's not one place, as is so popularly believed in the church today. If that's a man, the view is he's got a soul in there somewhere. The Bible doesn't teach that. That's Watchman Nee, that's your teachers who are going about teaching today. They're not theologians, they're not Old Testament scholars, most of them. Therefore, they just pick up what somebody else has said. But the Bible shows that man is a living soul. If you're here last week, there's a difference between having a soul and being a soul. Now, that's what the Bible says. Genesis 2:7, God breathed into man's nostrils the breath of life, man became a living soul. So the soul is the man. It's not in every cell in my body. It's not just in my hands or feet or chest region. I am the soul. We covered all of that in the first several weeks of study of biblical theology. That's the mimeograph notes, I believe. And it's erroneous to say, as we pointed out last time, that man is spirit. Man is not spirit. God is spirit. It's erroneous to say man is spirit with a soul in living in a body. That's the Greek idea. It's not biblical at all. Biblical concept that man is a soul. Body plus spirit equals soul. Genesis chapter 2 teaches that. God created His body out of the dust of earth. That's body, flesh. He breathed into His nostrils spirit. Spirit plus body, what did it say became? A soul. And the word soul is translated off in the Old Testament the person, because it is the person. And so as the soul is everywhere in the body, so God, being Spirit, can be everywhere at one and the same time. That brought us to where we were, and so that's where we take up today. God's presence fills the universe. I believe, as we also said, not as smoke fills a room, or water fills a bottle, but God's omnipresent means there is no part of the universe, no part of heaven or earth, that God is not personally and actively present. That's what omnipresence means. So we raise the question to begin tonight: if God doesn't occupy space, then where is heaven, since God dwells in heaven? Since Christ has a glorified body, when he became incarnate, Logos, God took upon himself humanity. He was, is, and remains forever from that moment God-man glorified. So that means he has a body somewhere. Glorified, spiritual, like ours will be. John says ours will be like his when he appears. It can go through walls. It can eat or not eat, as we see demonstrated in the Gospels. But he does have a body, doesn't it? It can appear or be invisible any way he wants it. That's the way ours will be like. But since he has a body, even though it's a spiritual body, it has to be somewhere. The Bible says it's at the right hand of God, at his throne. So if God doesn't occupy space and thrones and bodies, even though spiritual bodies need space, then how can we talk about God not needing space? See, these are questions that need to be answered, unless you just want a few proof texts saying God's omnipotent or omniscient, omnipresent. Are we swamping you, or do you want us to go on? Well, these are questions. Theologians used to sit around and figure out how many angels could stand on the head of a pin, because they don't occupy space, they said. Well, we're not digressing into such meaningless arguments, but these are valid ones, because everybody has wrong concepts of God. And as soon as you say God is spirit and doesn't need space, then that raises problems, as you're going to see in the teaching tonight.
Tonight, though, you touch on his hands and things like that, the physical part.
Well, that gets into anthropomorphism. Maybe we can, but it's a whole another realm. Where are the angels if spirits don't occupy space? There are innumerable angels. Where is Satan and the demons in his kingdom, since spirits don't occupy space? Where are the departed dead? They don't have bodies, but they are living persons somewhere. Where is heaven and hell? These are places in the Bible. And yet, to talk about places, you need space. And yet, the spiritual dimension doesn't have space. You should have been writing down some of those things, but that's all right, because we're going to answer them. Then you won't know what we answered in your notes. But it's necessary to define space from two aspects as it pertains to us and as it relates to God. And when you see that, you'll see that it's possible for God and heaven to be somewhere, and yet there be no space for them to be in. So we have to, and this is often true, I guess, as you've noticed as we study theology, most people are always looking at the forest and they can't see the trees. You can't understand things about God by looking at us and reasoning up to God. It doesn't work that way. That's natural theology of Thomas Aquinas, as we told you, and it's not valid. God isn't bigger, just a bigger man. You know, he isn't what we are except bigger and stronger. He's other than, the Bible says, what we are. He is spirit alone. Anytime you hear anyone today saying man is spirit, he's missed it 100%. That's as far as you can miss it. He didn't miss it 98.9%. He missed it 100%. Man is not spirit. Man is flesh, who has spirit from God, the life principle. But man is soul. God is spirit. But anyway, that's not our subject at this point. So we have to define space with respect to man and to God. So let's define our space a little more clearly. We may define our space. If we go too fast, we'll just yell. We define our space as that form of reality in which created objects can exist. God had to make space before he could make anything to put it in. We just demonstrated that a moment ago, and as well as last week, except a little more comprehensively last week. So our space is that form of reality in which created objects can exist. Two objects cannot occupy the same space at the same time, so space is necessary. Or to express it differently, space is necessary to maintain separate identity. If there were no space in this room, we'd all be one body. And then you'd still need space for the one. Our space means two objects is necessary because two objects can't occupy the same space at the same time. We need space to maintain separate identity. Without space, all things become one. So that's very easily demonstrated. You want to bake a cake? We got an egg. Let's make a banana cake. So we got a banana. We'll need milk in it, won't we? So we'll have a milk carton. What else goes in the cake? We need a bowl of flour, don't we? We need some baking powder, spices. Every one of those occupies space and they have separate identity. When you mix them all, you end up with something about like that. It lost its identity, and the reason it did, there's no space between the separate objects any longer. Therefore, they all occupy the same space. But you see, in order to maintain identity, God had to create space. There has to be some distance even between God and us, even though He's in us. Well, I said right when we started that you're not going to get Halley's Handbook. You won't even get what they're getting in the seminary. You'll get more. You're getting deeper than that. I know because I've had the seminary teaching from more than one school. And so God has given us bodies. Therefore, He has to give us space to maintain individual identity. A table is not a chair for the same reason. Space separates them. A cover of a book is never the back, never can be, because space separates them. Doesn't matter how thin you slice the cheese, the top's never the bottom. Space will always separate. As soon as there's no space, there's nothing. Well, I think we've made our point on the necessity of space. That's our space. We're saying God is omnipresent, everywhere present. He can be that because He's Spirit, and spirits do not occupy space. They have no spread. There's no dimension. Time, space has nothing to do with God's realm. Nothing at all. They were created the moment He created the universe. The moment He created anything, time began for it. It has beginning, continuance, and end. And it had to occupy space. Time and space are obvious creations. Now we come to God's dimension. Where is heaven, we said, and where is the end of space, and where's the kingdom of darkness and light, heaven and hell? Where are all the angels? What do they occupy if they don't have space? That's what we're looking at. All right, God's domain is another dimension. It's the spiritual dimension. Now that's the whole key to omnipresence. We're talking about two different dimensions. Quit trying to figure out how God can exist without space to exist in. And if there wasn't some sort of separateness, then all the angels and God and everything that's spiritual would just be one lump or mass if there wasn't space. You see, you're thinking from your dimension up to God, and you can't do that. See, don't try to look at objects in space and say, well, because God is not the Son and the Father, not the Holy Spirit, yet they're one God, and yet they're different aspects of the one God, and there are billions of angels and other spiritual creatures, then there has to be space, or how could they not all just be one? And so you're thinking, see, reasoning up from our dimension to God and His dimension, you can't do it. So that's the key, and you have to get that set in your mind to understand God's omnipresence, or even God as Spirit, or heaven. God's dimension, God's domain is another dimension. It's the spiritual dimension. It cannot be compared to or understood from the standpoint of space, created space. Can't be explained, compared, understood from this standpoint. The spiritual dimension, this is it, if you catch it, the spiritual dimension permeates our dimension. You know what permeate means? Like smoke fills a room, it saturates it. The spiritual dimension permeates our dimension, and it's infinite. There is no end to the spiritual dimension. You see, you can't even use terms that you can understand what I'm talking about. You can't come to the end of God's dimension. It's infinite. Now, if you're thinking of space, you've missed it already. It's another dimension. You know, another dimension's like another subject we're talking about. The spiritual dimension permeates our dimension. It was already here when God created the finite, visible space that we see when we look out. Well, when we look in the room or outside. It was already here. See, God isn't off in heaven somewhere, and we have to talk about off and up and down, but which way's up? You point this way, but if you were on long distance phone and asked the Chinaman to point, he wouldn't be pointing the same direction, or he'd be pointing the opposite. That's down for you. And the earth turns a little, up's no longer there. Let it turn long enough, it's directly east. Then it's directly south, then it's directly west, and finally comes back to up again. But up, these are relative terms. Now, this does not mean that heaven isn't a place. Heaven is a place. But what you've got to see, that God's dimension is already here everywhere. And ours is like a bubble in it. If you think of the infinite ocean, not infinite, looks infinite when you're flying across it. Let's just say that there's no edge here, and this is the ocean. And you can fly across it in a 707 Boeing jet, and you're just a little tiny grain of sand on that vast sea. And yet, of course, it isn't limitless, but it's pretty big to demonstrate my point. And make that God's realm, God's dimension, which is limitless, because there's no limits to spiritual dimension. There are no limits. Our universe, which seems infinite, space does, is just a bubble in that. You see, the infinite spiritual dimension was already there, and it just permeates ours. See how I covered it up? It was already there. And if all of that's the spiritual dimension. Now, admittedly, that looks like space I'm drawing, and that's the only way you can demonstrate it. But that isn't space I'm talking about. That's another dimension, which permeates ours. Space is like a bubble in it. So questions are often raised, what would happen? Let's get back to our dimension now, to space. What would happen if you could walk far enough, and remember, as far as they can see with the telescopes, billions of light years, space just goes on, and great galaxies as big as our whole galaxy, billions of them are in every direction. They're all traveling away from one another at tremendous rates of speed, going somewhere. In each galaxy, billions of stars. But if you could walk long enough, then the question's often raised in philosophical circles and those of physics and science and so forth. What would happen when you came to the end of space? Would you walk through it into the other dimension? Would you, if you came to the edge of space, walk into God's heaven? What is it on the other side of space? So first of all, we'll dispense with that with the theory. You've got to have some concept of space, that space is curved. Now this has nothing to do with the Bible. I just want to dispense with this. This is number one. We're going to dispense with that. That space is curved. And it's a good theory, because it can't be infinite. It was created. Nothing's infinite but God. And the reason we said His dimension is infinite is simply because the spiritual dimension has no limitations of space, since there isn't any to begin with. Now think of this as billions and trillions and trillions and trillions and trillions. You couldn't even count them. There are not enough zeros put out here for the dimension of space. And space certainly can't be square to begin with. Everything in the universe is round, spherical. And the theory is, that's the Earth. Theory is, if you started walking in space, and you go for all these billions of years, you see, it'd take you to walk to the edge of it. You'd never get to the edge of it, because you'd keep coming back on yourself if it's curved. And eventually you'd end up where you started. Well, that isn't hard to conceive, because that's precisely what happens on the earth. If you started at this point and kept walking, you wouldn't walk off the edge of the earth. That used to be thought in Columbus's day. But if you keep walking, you're going to end up exactly where you started, if you could walk in a straight line, of course. So if space is curved, you can't come to the end of it, because you keep walking. You're walking in the dimension of a curved situation, and you come back on yourself. So you can never get to the edge of it. Even scientifically, they've ruled that out. But biblically, as we're showing you, more importantly, you could never come to the edge of space and walk through to the other side, because there is no other side. We just told you that. This doesn't mean space is infinite, but it means the spiritual dimension permeates ours, and there's no walking out of this visible dimension into the spiritual. The spiritual's already here. You just can't see it. You're just a bubble in God's dimension. You see, before He created anything visible, everything that He made, or He Himself, which is unmade, it already existed. It didn't need space, because it was spirit. Now, let me show you from Scripture that the spiritual dimension permeates ours, and therefore you can't walk out of space into God's dimension, because God's dimension, you're already in it. Yes, you are. You're already in it, and He's already in yours. Now, we haven't said it all when we say these things. We have to take it a step at a time. Let's look at 2 Kings 6. And you see that the spiritual dimension permeates ours. It's there all along. It just takes God to open your eyes, and you'll see. If He opens your eyes now, you'd see angels. Sometimes you'd see demons, because sometimes people bring them in. Well, that's just reality. We know those things. We're just trying to relate those things we know to what we're talking about God's omnipresence. This is the case of Elisha, and his servant. And the king of Syria wanted to war against Israel, and every time he would lay his plans, the prophet Elisha would tell the king of Israel, the king of Syria's plans. And the king of Syria gathered his generals together one day and said, "Who's revealing my plans?" And one of them said, "No one. There's a prophet down in Israel that knows you're going in and going out. He knows what you say in your bedchamber." Verse 12, one of his servants said, "None, my lord, O king, but Elisha the prophet," that's in Israel, "telleth the king of Israel the words that you speak in your bedchamber." How you like that? No privacy. So, verse 13, the king of Syria said, "Go and spy where he is, that I may send and fetch him." And it was told him, saying, "Behold, he's in Dothan." Therefore sent he thither horses and chariots, a great host. And they came by night and compassed the city about. This is 2 Kings 6:14. And when the servant of the man of God was risen early, see, the servant of Elisha, and gone forth, behold, a host compassed the city, both with horses and chariots, all those to take one man, Elisha. And his servant said unto him, "Alas, my master, what shall we do?" And he answered, "Fear not, for they that be with us are more than they that be with them." With him, he said. They're already with us. He could see them. And Elisha prayed and said, "Lord, I pray thee open his eyes also," he could say. "Open his eyes also that he may see." And the Lord opened the eyes of the young man, he saw, and behold, the mountain was full of horses and chariots of fire round about Elisha. I mean, the spiritual dimension's already here, friends. You don't have to say, what would happen if I'd walk out of this dimension into another? You don't walk out of it. It's here. It was already here. If we are the intruders, if anything, it's here. But it's the invisible dimension. It's the spaceless one. It's the timeless one. Turn to Mark 5. You'll see that the spiritual dimension has nothing to do with space. It permeates ours. It can permeate our dimension infinitely. This is proven in a way you probably wouldn't have thought about, that the spiritual dimension can permeate the physical or visible one infinitely. Jesus went over to the country of the Gadarenes, Mark 5:1. And you know the demoniac was there, bound with chains, wild man, out of his mind. When he saw Jesus, verse 6, he ran, worshipped him, and cried with a loud voice, "What have I to do with thee, Jesus, thou Son of the Most High God? I adjure thee by God that thou torment me not." For he had said unto him, "Come out of the man, thou unclean spirit." See, that took place already. So he asked him, "What is thy name?" Jesus said to the spirit, "What is thy name?" And he said, "My name is Legion, for we are many." And he besought him much that he would not send him away out of the country. And there was nigh unto the mountains a great herd of swine feeding, and the demons besought him, saying, plural, you see, "Send us into the swine, that we may enter them." And forthwith Jesus gave them leave, and the unclean spirits went out, entered in the swine. The herd ran violently down a steep place into the sea, about 2,000, and were choked in the sea. If you had one demon and one hog, there'd be 2,000 that man. He said our name's Legion. What is a legion in Roman terms? 1,000 men? 6,000? 6,000 then. You see, demon spirits don't occupy space. So there could be an infinite number in a person. Sometimes are. Well, not infinite numbers in them, but I mean great numbers. It's not uncommon at all for 100 demons to come out of a person. Not that that happens every day. I said it isn't uncommon. I remember one sister telling me that, I don't know what we were talking about several years ago, someplace I was teaching. She said, she was talking about how God had shown her this other dimension, that it's right here, and said she saw at one place, wherever she was, she saw this man, or there was a man there, and she happened to look over at him and said he was demon-possessed. Of course, no one else knew it. He acted fairly normal in where he was. But she said the demons were swarming in and out of him like bees in a hive. Well, I said, that's right. They don't occupy space. You see, how could a man have 100 demons instead of one? It's simply because they don't occupy space. See, you're talking about another dimension. And you can't think of it in spatial terms. So that dimension is here. And so Mark 5 is another text to show you that that dimension permeates ours. You see, those demons just could permeate that man, fill him, and yet he wasn't full because there could have been 12,000 in him. They don't. If there's no occupying of space, do you understand? Then numbers are not the way you evaluate or determine how many can be there. Well, if you don't have any questions, I'm going to keep going. I'll tell you, friends, the depth of the Word of God is cannot be fathomed if we had 1,000 years. Paul said, "Oh, the depth and the unsearchable riches of God. Who has known the mind of the Lord?" Okay.
Demons and angels are spirit beings, correct? They're not spirit. Only God is spirit.
They're spiritual beings.
They're spiritual beings.
Spiritual beings. He maketh. You see, everything's from God. God is spirit. He makes spiritual beings. The scriptures say he maketh his angels spirits, but they're spiritual beings. They're not flesh. That's to contrast the fact they're not man. But they're created spirits, created personalities, like we are created personalities that are flesh, are soulish, and they are spirit beings. You see, we are not spirit, only God is spirit. We don't get a spirit body, that's spiritualism. We get a spiritual body in the resurrection. 1 Corinthians 15 makes it plain. You have an earthly body, you'll get a spiritual body. It'll be a body, but it's spiritual, like Jesus' body.
Then the question that I might pose concerning the faith relationship is, since they are spiritual beings, they are limited. Only God's spirit, so he's infinite. So they are finite beings.
Yeah.
So there is but I can't understand, I can't equate it in my mind, if they operate in this other realm, in this other dimension, that isn't a dimension of space, yet they are limited.
Limited in what way? You mean in power, wisdom? Yes,
well,
because they're created. In what?
But I don't know, maybe it's a little bit.
Well, they're not omnipresent, if that's what. No.
So they are limited, but they're
Omnipresence isn't omnipresent. See, we're not done with it yet, but presence isn't just God being somewhere everywhere at once. But you can't separate that from his all-knowing, his omniscience. You see, he knows everything that's going on too, so all of these things are involved. And angels, you can't say that of them. Of course, in the spiritual dimension, angels are of such a higher magnitude than man that you're again talking about another dimension, and you can't compare space, time, flesh, created things with physical things with spiritual things. They're quite powerful. They were so powerful they revolted in heaven.
right.
That's
They
the
are
point.
beings, and what I'm trying to think about is that since they operate in the spiritual realm, they are beings, and that means that they are finite.
Finite, yes.
And that means to a certain extent that they take up a certain amount of spiritual space.
Glad you got spiritual space in there.
Well, I don't know how else to say it. You see, if I said they didn't, if they weren't.
Well, the thing is, though, you're still looking at your dimension and trying to reason up to the other, and that isn't the way you approach it. We're talking about another subject entirely when we talk about God's domain, the spiritual dimension. But if you let me get through it all, I mean, the questions are valid because I ask a lot of questions to use to get you to thinking. Or you just get swamped by the deeper teachings in theology. So I have to raise questions to show you what we're talking about. Like where is heaven? What's on the other side of space? When you get to thinking along that line, then you can see. Then when we say nothing's on the other side because there isn't any other side. that the spiritual dimension is all there is. Space was created within that, you see. And when everything becomes spiritual, a spiritual heaven and spiritual earth, well, we'll have maybe a third dimension to talk about. Somebody had a question?
Yeah, that was my question. God is infinite, is there infinite dimensions? And would this then include the spiritual dimension of God, including all the infinite dimensions?
No, there are no infinite dimensions except the spiritual dimension. It's infinite, but you see, if you're thinking of space, you've missed it. See, we just said that a while ago, but I know that you can't grasp everything we're saying in a moment, but nothing is infinite but God. And so when we're talking about the spiritual dimension being infinite, we simply mean that it isn't limited in human concepts as you think of space being limited. Nothing is infinite but God in the ultimate sense.
The demons can be seen, though. They apparently have some kind of boundary, you know.
Yeah, y'all are getting ahead of me. Why don't you let me finish? Because but you're missing it at the same time. You know, it is repetitious for me to say it, but it doesn't sound repetitious when you keep asking the questions. But you're talking about our dimension when you talk about they have to occupy space or something. See, you're thinking in our terms. The Gadarene demoniac had at least 6,000 demons, and even if he had only 100, where would 100 be if they occupied space? They don't. You see, you can't even talk about space. We're talking about another dimension. But when you get finished, I mean, space is emptiness. God doesn't need emptiness to exist. Okay, anybody, holler out.
How on earth can
That's my point, you see. All right, go ahead. Now that we located you, okay.
And they don't occupy space. I believe it, but I don't understand it.
They can localize themselves somewhere in our space. God localized himself on the ark in the Holy of Holies. He says so 2 or 3 times in the Old Testament, and the Old Testament at the same time says he's everywhere. He sits on a throne in heaven. Heaven is a place. You know, we've said these things, so don't miss what we're saying and make us say something we're not saying. Heaven is a real place. Hell is a real place. And you go from here to there to get to it. But some of you may be getting it. You don't have to go anywhere to get to the spiritual dimension. It permeates ours. I didn't say hell was like right here, or heaven was right up there. They are places. But you see, even there, we are inadequate because we have to use terms that we understand. God doesn't have to use those terms. We're back to faith. When you pray, believe you have received. Why can he say that? No time in that dimension of his. Just as soon as you meet the condition, it is done. Time relates to us. If he delays the manifestation 6 weeks, that is in relation to us, not to him. That's how many times the sun turns in relation, the earth in relation to our sun. That's time. But I had to say that about heaven being a place because I'm afraid some of you are missing it like I'm saying, well, just heaven's anywhere. No, we're not saying that. God's throne is somewhere. He's everywhere, and yet he localizes himself on a throne, and Jesus sits at his right hand. But see, he chooses to do that. And if you think God is just on a throne somewhere, then you've missed the whole Bible teaching that he's everywhere. But we already said last week, don't mix that up with pantheism. Some people take truth and then say, well, if he's everywhere, then he must be in everything, and so God must be everything. Now make your questions valid. If you say, how on earth, why we're still missing it.
Does Jesus' resurrection body occupy space?
Well, you see, we just have to finish the teaching, because your questions are still spatially oriented. You see, now I'm not trying to be hard, but this will help you see these things more easily than me just giving you some principles and teachings. For you to ask the question, does his body occupy space, you're still thinking spatially. And this is another dimension entirely, the spiritual one. You can't talk about does his body occupy space, or you put him right back in here to the visible, created dimension. Now that doesn't mean he isn't somewhere. So we have to get to the teaching, what do we mean by God's, quote, space, unquote.
You talked about spiritual dimension and earthly dimension. I was wondering, in regard to 2 Corinthians, where Paul talks about being in the third heaven, are there dimensions of heaven, like a third dimension and a fourth dimension?
No, not dimensions, but first heaven's the atmosphere, second heaven outer space, third heaven is God's dimension. That's all he was saying. 3 dimensions. I mean, any good commentary will tell you that, what third heaven is. First heaven is always atmosphere. So you get into spheres, you get into spiritualism and occultism, because they teach various spheres of spiritual existence, and you grow out of one into another.
Would people see spiritual beings in a way that they can, like finite things, like something right there, they see it occupying something? Is the only reason they see it that way is because it's the only thing they can comprehend?
You mean they see it occupying space?
Yeah. Like
It doesn't occupy space. It'll walk through a wall, come down through a ceiling, up through the drain pipe. It doesn't. But spirits sometimes, look at it from their side. They've come into your dimension, so they're going to accommodate themselves at a certain amount to your dimension. But often they don't. You cast a demon out, sometimes he'll go out a door because he's come into your dimension. But often he doesn't. He simply goes through a wall or disappears. Jesus appeared in the room. The doors were all locked. He just appeared. He had his spiritual body. And he said, remember, I'm not a spirit. He's the human God-man glorified. He's not a spirit any longer. He has a spiritual body, a glorified body. He's the man Jesus, God, man. Never can cease to be God, but now he can never cease to be man. He didn't cease to become Jesus when he was resurrected. He's the first of those from the resurrection.
Are you saying that now Jesus is different now than he was before he came to earth?
What do you mean by different? I just mean he has a glorified body. Not different, no. Not different. No, he was, John 1, the Logos. He was he was and is, of course, but was the eternal Son of God who was Spirit. He took upon himself flesh, and now he remains glorified flesh. He has the spiritual body. See, the body, Scriptures show that he is the first fruits of the resurrection. John says, we know not what we'll be like, but when he appears, we'll be like him. Well, I'll never get through. I'll let you meditate on between now and next week. Now, let me say something, friends, because I think it's necessary. Don't go to the Scriptures to try to prove some other side. The Scriptures say, search, the Bereans receive the Word with all readiness of mind. You go to the Scriptures to see that they're so, not to see that they're not so. So don't come with questions next week. Anytime I start detecting argumentative, not that there were any here tonight, but I can, by postponing this till next week, I know that one or two could fall into that snare and try to prove some other point. I hope you see what I'm saying, because I won't answer any questions that are of an argumentative nature. You say, can't there be another side? Well, if I thought there was, I wouldn't be teaching this. So you've got... I'm only scratching the surface of theology. I mean, how could you ever fathom the depth of these things? But you see, and I say this in love, but by our very questions, we're making God finite. We're trying to reason from what we are up to God. And God is so much other than what we are in every respect. He is completely other than what we are. Completely other. And His dimension is completely other than this one. And all we're trying to do is to help you comprehend the bigness of God by these diagrams and our teaching, constantly contrasting the two. And you get a little further glimpse of the greatness of God. Well, we'll take up there next time. We'll begin that God's dimension is spiritual, but, listen to this, we can't define it merely as spacelessness. Now, we didn't say it had space. Listen to the words. You'll not understand God's dimension by saying it's spaceless. You have to use different terms. You have to think differently. You have to think from God's side.
Under the definition of space, if I copied it down correctly, it says that form of reality in which created objects exist.
Can exist. Yeah.
Can exist. Now, where it says created objects, I was thinking, after you explained it, I understood it more, but I was thinking of angels and demonic spirits, and they are created beings, but they are not created objects. Is that the difference, that they couldn't fall in this class here?
Well, you see, they are spirit beings. They don't occupy space. They're in that other dimension. So when we're talking about, we said we had to define space from our standpoint, created beings from God. So when we define God's space, we're defining God's dimension. We're defining everything that exists in it, even though it was created. So spirit beings don't occupy space, if that's what you're asking, whether they're created or not. Space is created. You see, you have to use other terms, but that doesn't mean God's dimension is spaceless. So you've got to see what we mean by God's dimension or God's, quote, space, unquote. Because you can't just say God's space. You have to put it in quotation marks, and whenever you do that to a word, you mean that it is to be unique and different.